I'm Ed Laws, one of the neurosurgeons at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and it's a pleasure to be here with you in Boston, in Harvey Cushing's home territory, to talk to you about an intriguing subject, namely the interaction between U.S. presidents and neurosurgeons. As you can imagine, some of these interactions were trivial, but many of them were profound. The people we're going to talk about are Harvey Cushing and his interaction with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We're also going to talk about John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and Mike Groff is going to help out with some of the spinal injuries that Kennedy had suffered. After that, we'd be discussing Ronald Reagan, and finally, George Herbert Walker Bush. Well, it turns out that Harvey Cushing had a unique family relationship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He and FDR became good friends because FDR's son Jimmy became engaged to Harvey Cushing's daughter Betsy. It was a long courtship. There was a lot of delay in getting the thing matured, but they were married and were initially very happily married. And Cushing and FDR had social interactions that you would expect. They also had some interactions that had to do with healthcare administration. And as you might imagine, politically they were almost polar opposites. And so they didn't see eye to eye on the political aspects of things, but they were friendly in-laws together.
Being in Boston, one of the most important presidents for us to discuss is John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Unfortunately, his story represents one of the most poignant examples of a president needing neurosurgical care. I think we're all familiar with the fatal gunshot and the neck injury he suffered and the neurosurgical care that he received as a result of that, culminating with the unfortunate pronouncement of his death by neurosurgeon W. Kemp Clark. What's also been written about extensively is the low back pain that he suffered with throughout his life and the impact that that had on his leadership. President Kennedy's low back pain started as a young child and then became exacerbated, perhaps with a football injury during his days at Harvard. He later enlisted in the military, and as we know, on board the PT-109 on that fateful night when it was rammed by a destroyer and ultimately sunk. His heroics on that night in saving all of the crew that didn't perish immediately exacerbated his low back pain. When he returned home, his back pain persisted, and he was evaluated at both the Leahy Clinic and the Mayo Clinic by Drs. Smith Peterson and White, who both recommended against surgery at that time. Unfortunately, his symptoms progressed, and he ultimately underwent decompression at both L4-5 and L5-S1 by Dr. James Poppin at the Leahy Clinic. His postoperative course was described as rocky, and subsequently, in 1954, he underwent a fusion of L5-S1 and the left sacroiliac joint under the care of Dr. Wilson at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York. That operation was also complicated postoperatively by a wound infection, and ultimately the Wilson plate had to be removed and the wound healed by secondary intention. His back pain progressed, and ultimately he came into contact with Dr. Janet Travail at Cornell and New York Hospital, where he was introduced to the now famous rocking chair, and non-operative care was emphasized over further operative interventions. He improved, although he required injections from time to time, particularly for the summit with Khrushchev. Overall, he did somewhat better. As you know, he went on to have a successful political career as a senator and then as a president. Tragically, the lumbar brace he wore may have left him more exposed to the subsequent gunshot wounds on that fateful day. As a spine practitioner, I can't help but be struck how little this great president was held back by his failed back syndrome and how much he benefited from non-operative care.
We're right here at the JFK Library, which is just a spectacular place, situated right on Boston Harbor and right on the waterfront. And what you see in the lawn outside of this fabulous museum, really, is the sloop Victoria that was actually sailed by the Kennedys and one of their passions. President Ronald Reagan was blessed with a devoted and caring wife, Nancy. Nancy happened to be the stepdaughter of a famous Chicago neurosurgeon, Loyal Davis. And Loyal Davis had trained here in Boston with Harvey Cushing, and then was the chief at Northwestern and a very influential person in the American College of Surgeons. When it came time to appoint a White House physician for President Reagan, it was a Chicago neurosurgeon named Dan Ruge. Dan was a very interesting fellow who was devoted to rehabilitative aspects of people who had spinal injuries. Reagan was giving a talk in Washington, D.C., and had a bullet wound taken immediately from the hotel to GW Hospital. And he had a chest wound and was very, very carefully and correctly cared for. He went to surgery, and before they put him to sleep, President Reagan said to the staff there, he said, "I hope all of you surgeons are Republicans," and went off to sleep. And they treated his chest wound quite well, and there was no problem. Many of you may not know that after the end of his presidency, Reagan took up horseback riding again. And he rode his horse into a tree limb and suffered a head injury, had a persisting headache, which was getting worse, and was diagnosed as a subdural hematoma. And Reagan went to the Mayo Clinic, where my former colleague and chief there, Thor Sunt, operated on him, evacuated the hematoma, and Reagan did fine, cracking jokes as he awoke from surgery. In 1989, during the Panama War, we received a call from the White House that President George H.W. Bush might have symptoms and signs of a cervical disc, and they needed to have a neurosurgeon examine him. And I happened to be the chair at GW at the time, and then the dean called me and said, "We're going to the White House." We got there, and the president was talking to the president of Colombia about the problems related to the Panama War. The president didn't have a shirt on, and when he was done, I was called to examine him. And thank goodness he had really no clinical signs of significant cervical disc, and we thought it was probably a cervical sprain. Well, each of these vignettes about presidents and neurosurgeons has its own message. I hope that you've enjoyed them, and I hope it sheds some light as to what our profession can contribute when it has to matters of grave political interest. Thanks.
Harvey Cushing is rightly known as the father of American neurosurgery. He was an extraordinary doctor who served on the faculties of several medical schools such as Yale and Harvard, and was responsible for many breakthroughs in neurological surgery. Today, his work is continued by the association that bore his name when it was founded, the American Association of Neurological Surgeons. His former assistant, my father-in-law, Loyal Davis, noted once that he had learned not only clinical neurological diagnosis and surgical techniques from this man, but many other things like professional discipline and dedication, not to mention, as Dr. Davis put it, how to write a medical article with style.
Had this accomplished. Means so much to all these millions of little children that we